Good evening and welcome to the Tuesday, July 24th Issaquah City Council Committee of the Whole Council meeting. I guess I said council several times in that sentence. We're going to start with ID 0264, which is the 2019 Community Fund Capacity Grant recommendations from our own Amy Dukes, Grants Coordinator.
Hi.
Welcome.
Good evening, council members. I am here tonight to give you just an overview of the 2019 Community Fund grant recommendations. This program continues to evolve both in the process by which we are reviewing the applications and also by how we're reporting on it to you. So in previous years, we have gone with a separate agenda bill and also the budgeting process. And this year, we decided it was more appropriate to bring it to you at Council of the Whole, and then you will see the recommendations during the normal budgeting process. And these will be within the mayor's budget and in all of the nonprofit funding area. So just to highlight a couple of things that are different this year, based on some input from council last year, we did create a community advisory panel, and we had that advisory panel review all the applications and make recommendations, much like we do for the arts grants or the human services grants. And then those were forwarded to the mayor for her endorsement, which she did actually endorse them all as they were recommended, so she made no changes to their recommendations. So then you will see these again during budgeting time in her budget. I can reiterate the criteria to you. So the review panel used these criteria as their main basis for evaluating the applications. They were looking for applications that showed organizational learning, development, and mission completion, that provided a compelling reason to engage in capacity building work, that had relevant technical, managerial, staff ability, and capacity demonstrated, that had a strategy for achieving and measuring the impact that they provide, that their proposed use of funds was detailed and justified, and that they provided supporting cost estimates. And I want to also remind you that in January, the groups that receive funding will come to you and provide a presentation to let you know exactly how they met the objectives that they set out to meet. So if you have questions about the individual applications, I'm happy to entertain any questions you have about the overall funding recommendations.
Councilmember Winterstein.
Thanks, Amy. More of a question about timing. So they're going to be in the 2019 budget proposal?
They are.
Okay, they are what?
They will be in the 2019 budget proposal.
But they're going to report to us in January?
Oh, I'm sorry. So the ones that were given this year will report to you in January on their outcomes. The ones that are given for 2019 will report to you in January 2020.
Okay, thank you.
So that's new. I'm sorry. This year was the first year that we had them actually come to you and report about what impact they made versus presenting to you on the front end, but then never coming back to you to tell you how it went. So we have changed that.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Ramos.
I'd like to compliment the changes. I think this is nice to get a little more handle on, a little more transparency, the group review, and you got good folks on there as far as the folks reviewing these and making recommendations. I like that process. I just have a few questions on how some of them were come about and so forth.
Sure.
So you took two of them and decided to put them under contract versus fund under this system. So will that funding then come through like Parks Department and go to them under that budget?
That's a great question. Actually, the funding will still come through the executive department budget. It will still be in the category with nonprofits. It's just a slightly different way in which we contract with the organizations. So for 2018, we just have a handful of groups like Friends of Issaquah Salmon Hatchery, Mountains to Sound, Chamber of Commerce, and the History Museums that we use contract for service process with. And those are because they're more general operating and support, and each year we evaluate what services we need from those organizations, but they're more ongoing. The capacity fund, the community grants, are really meant to be a 1 or maybe 2-time infusion of cash to really help them get to a new, a mission objective, or to get over a hump that, they might have with staffing or professional development, things like that. So it's not really intended to be more of an ongoing service that they're providing to the community.
And I understand that. And so with that, I'd ask the Friends of Lake Sammamish, this is a 4th year running, and it's basically the same project.
Right.
And when we talked about it first, it was the first time we proved that it was a one-time deal to get half funding of a person to become their fundraiser so they could raise that. And the second year was kind of, okay, we'll give them another year to basically raise their own funds to be self-supporting. So, and I love what they do, don't get me wrong, but we're in the 4th year of, it seems like the same thing, of getting them started where they can raise their own funding. We're expected that to be, like you mentioned, a year or 2.
Right.
And now we're in the 4th year. So I'm just questioning what it looks like. And then you put it into a contract for service, and it looks like that's just accepted as an ongoing thing for quite a long time.
Right, so the contracts for service do get evaluated every year, but the panel recommended that if they were going to continue to ask for general operating support, that it really just didn't make sense to be in this competitive category because their application is quite different. They weren't talking about a project, they were really talking about the entire organization. And the panel felt like they provide a real service to the community, being an advocate for the state park. So that was their recommendation, which the mayor endorsed. But, I know that it has come up year to year, so.
Well, and I understand, and they do great stuff. I'm just trying to figure out how this is ongoing into the future as we're looking at that long-term, because that's, like you say, it's not the goal of this funding source.
Right.
And you're putting it under contract, which makes sense, but then it looks like it's taken out of this and now becoming just an ongoing cost. So I'm trying to figure out how that, so next year, will they reapply again for this funding?
Well,
I mean, if they
right.
choose to, and still
So-
come under this funding stream, but again, just instead of using a grant, use a contract.
Right, so the more appropriate ask, if they, just as an example, if they were going to come back to this fund next year, would really be to ask for the type of staffing support that would enable them to fundraise so that they can support staff. It wouldn't be to just keep funding the existing staff that they have. So I guess this is kind of an annual, decision that's made and recommendation that's made, and this is the recommendation that's being made for 2019. But you all can certainly discuss that.
Something to say?
Deputy Council President Batiste.
Thank you, Amy, for I think that more information about these, the grants in general and the community fund grants is really important. I know that over the years we've had a lot of questions that have come up between the human services grants and now the grants that fall under this that used to be the mayor's grants, and being able to better and further define the overview and the panel, and just having the information in front of us early, I think is a great step forward. I too really I have some similar questions to Councilmember Ramos with the two groups that have come forward and are being pulled out and moving over to contract. I mean, I guess one of the and both groups do amazing work, and so being able to put them in, with a contract that would allow ongoing is something that could be considered. But I think that one of the high-level questions that gets lost a little bit is maybe for groups is what is the difference between what I would do to go forward with the grant with the Human Services Commission and then the community grants. And then this seems like it's opening a third pathway or something new. that there are a couple groups that have applied over and over, and now they're going to contract. Could you just speak a little bit?
Well, in the instance of both of those organizations, they are not ones that really are very eligible for human services or arts commission support unless they're, in the case of Friends of Lake Sammamish, they actually get some arts grants to do some arts programming. But there really isn't another funding category available to nonprofits that don't sort of fall into the arts and culture or the human services category. That would be one. Reasons like we do support Mountains to Sound through a contract for service. And so there are just kind of a handful of these nonprofit organizations that, are felt like important to the community, providing services that the city wants provided but does not provide itself. But it's an interesting collection of nonprofit support. And these were all funded through mayor's discretionary grants previously. So there was, in the past, I'd say 5 years, there was some sort of parsing out which ones are more like a contract for service and which ones should really be put into a competitive grant program. So it's kind of still evolving, I would say. And it does change year to year, for sure.
So it sounds like as the community grants have become more defined, then that has also sort of pointed to these great groups in the city that are falling outside of
Yes,
these two
that's
areas,
correct.
still need to be and want to be able to apply for help to do the great work they do, but they're outside
Right.
of the scope.
That's correct. You articulated that much better than I did.
Thank you.
So I'll ask, so we look at our dollars per capita into human services, right?
Correct. I
And we had
believe so.
previously a goal of $10 per capita, right? So how, as we create this sort of third category, how does that factor into, if at all, do we take a holistic overview of all of our human services spending and understand what it looks like in total?
That's a good question. There is a exhibit with the memo that provided sort of a table of which ones also receive funding from either arts or human services. So you can see that some of them are receiving funding from multiple categories. The review panel did take that information into consideration as well when they were looking at the requests. They also wanted to know what the groups were receiving other funding from the city for. So we definitely haven't kind of added that to the per capita spending or anything like that to blend the programs, but there was definitely an awareness of other funding that they were receiving. And in some cases, that did influence the recommendation that the groups received from this review panel.
So nominally, what does this time at this point of the year in 2019, what's it going to look like for council's review of these two new, the two organizations that are going to go into this new path?
And if they were to follow the same path as the other organizations that have contracts for service, you would see them listed in the proposed budget each year, but they wouldn't necessarily come to you for, a formal presentation. We can certainly add all the nonprofits that receive any type of funding to that presentation, but currently, so for example, in 2018, you all saw the groups that received community funding. You didn't see the contracts for service groups come to present to you, but we could certainly, I would assume, add that. It's a small
so
list.
contracts for services are organizations that the city hires to do specific things, right?
Correct.
And how is Friends of Lake Sammamish like that?
Well, they're providing a connection. They're liaisoning with the city and with the state park system and communicating between us. And I know from arts projects that I've worked on, it is very challenging to reach the correct person at the state park system. So I know that they have provided that sort of communication channel and that advocacy channel for the city.
But we have our own communications directly with state parks, right? It's not like they're acting as our lobbyist with state parks, right?
No, but they are definitely, for example, the new playground that was built at the park really happened because they were able to do private fundraising and bring a large sum of those funds to the table to make that happen, which if they did not do that, I imagine that playground would not have been constructed.
Got it. Councilmember Ray.
So just a couple fun questions for you.
Okay.
We just want to make it interesting. So I noticed that nobody got everything that they wanted in terms of the amount requested versus the amount granted. But I did notice that there was some disparity between some that got like 90+% and some that were in the 30% range. I'm just curious what the criteria was used to say how much we funded of each request.
So it was a panel of humans, so definitely more art than science, but the way that we did the review this year was to have all of the reviewers use the criteria to come up with a funding amount that they felt matched how well the application addressed the criteria. But they did take other things into consideration. So they did take in that other support from other city funding programs. They also scrutinized the budgets pretty significantly. And so some of them actually had some things in their budgets that really weren't fundable by the city. For example, the East Side Friends of Seniors only got half of their request because half of their request was for hotels and meals while they're at those conferences. So the committee wanted to fund their professional development, but could really only fund their attendance at the conference registration part of that. So there's sort of a little story, I guess, behind all of them, and I'm happy to provide it if that is helpful. But they really looked at the budgets to make sure that we could fund what they were asking for.
Yeah, and I don't know that we need to go into it
Yeah.
tonight, but I just think in being transparent and fair,
Yeah.
so that, someone says, wow, I got 30% of what I asked for, and they got 90% of what they asked for, how come? Because it'll just make it easier for people to understand. And then one final question for you. These are capacity building grants, correct?
Correct.
So I think I'm picking up on where Councilmember Ramos was going, which is if we have things that are really contracts for services, are those really capacity building or are those ongoing services? And
Right.
so should we find a different funding mechanism than truly capacity building? Because in my belief around capacity building, we should see it once or twice, and then they should build that capacity and come back with something new and fun and exciting for us to do.
Correct. And that was why the panel recommended that those move to the contract for service. I mean, they certainly endorse both of those organizations as
yeah.
providing excellent services that the city desires. But it was as much that as it was, these don't belong in this category and therefore need to be in that other category. So,
Actually, Councilmember Winterstein?
Well, I've gone once, so I'll
Oh.
defer.
All right, then.
Thanks.
Councilmember Hunt?
So I have a question about sort of the long-term trends in the asks versus the amount that's being given overall. And thank you for answering the questions that I had emailed. But I think I recall that when we were talking about the Human Services Grant, there's this increase as the population grows, which would be expected, but there's an increase in the asks over time, and there's an increase also in the organizations that are coming forward and applying for grants. And then that doesn't seem to be the case with these. And so I wondered if you could talk about that, because the trend is actually that this total amount asked is less this year than previous years.
It is less this year. I think it's because the nature of the funding, it really is intended to be capacity building. So there probably are a lot of organizations that would love some funding, but they don't exactly have a project that fits this at this moment in time. We have had we've turned away groups. This is the first year that everyone that requested funding is being recommended for funding. We have had years where we've let groups know that your request just simply doesn't meet the capacity building funding pool. So I think this is the fourth year that we've changed the guidelines to be capacity building specific. And I think that some of that decrease in requests is just our nonprofits starting to better understand what this funding program is meant for, and so only applying if they have an appropriate program.
Okay, and how do you let organizations know that this capacity grant is available? How do you communicate with them
So
initially?
it is communicated out through all of the city's traditional channels of our e-news and on our website, as well as all of the staff members that service nonprofits in our community send it out to all of their lists. So Human Services staff person would send it to all the Human Services organizations that have ever applied. Same thing for arts, for parks, for economic development.
Councilmember Winterstein.
Thank you, Amy. I appreciate your time here. So the contracts for service so that does have my attention, and I do agree, and you've already heard this evening, and I thank you for the information that's in the letter that talks about when we first funded the Friends Group, and for just, I was highly involved with that in the beginning. Matter of fact, the administration had originally turned them down, and we asked them to come anyway and make a pitch directly to the council. And during that process, they got their nonprofit status, and then all of a sudden they were eligible. And we called upon some Amish and said, come on, do it now, so let's get these guys off the ground. And that was always with the strong commitment that they would develop a development capacity. And so I'm disappointed that hasn't happened. And I don't know the reasons why or why not, but I understand this recommendation. It really doesn't feel like the same contracts as, I think the chamber is down home 4th of July.
It's just specific to the 4th.
Very specific. So we used to run that parade, and now the chamber does it for us. History Museum is probably because of the archiving and just for the preservation of historical artifacts and records. I mean, that we're contracting that service for them. And you said Mountains to Sound Greenway. What
Yes.
do you know what theirs is?
Do you all know? I don't know specifically.
So that's okay, the details, but so it feels like a stretch to me to put actually both of these organizations in there. I mean, they're great organizations that do things that we value, I personally value, and I know many of the community value, and we hope that they're successful long-term. There's no doubt about all that. But this has gone a little askew, that it says right in here, for Friends, it's organizations' operations in its entirety. That is, well, that's not.
Yeah, I mean, if we
That's
just
not quite right.
look at the budget that they've provided in their application, their budget is primarily staff.
Right. I'm just saying that when I really compare it to I compare the history and kind of what was the promise when we brought it and we decided to fund them originally, this hasn't really worked out that way. And now to be in the contract for service category, well, it's gone off a little bit more. So I'm very interested in learning, hearing more because about their plans on whether or not they're really going to develop this development or fundraising capability. Because without that, I mean, we can't be they're a department of the city if we're providing 100% of their funds. And so we have to have some conversation here. That's not quite what we envisioned, and the commitment we were trying to make 3 years ago when we first funded them. I'm not as familiar with the Trails Club, but it says in the document, serving as a valuable link among the volunteers, trail users, and the city. And I understand that liaison role, but again, it sounds like a slight redefinition of the contract for service when you consider parades and historical stuff that the other groups do. So I'm just raising just a little yellow flag so you know where my head is. I know that these are still going to come through the budgeting
Correct.
process.
Yeah.
And I would be happy to get more detailed, maybe testimony from those organizations about their longevity going forward, because because this, especially at 100% of operation, that's counter to kind of unwritten city policy for nonprofits.
Right. So
And,
this is actually not 100% of their budget, but the request would cover, the recommendation covers operations. It's not a project or program.
Okay, so
Yeah.
in the memo, it says
misleading?
operations, in organizations' operations in its entirety. So I meant that, I took that to be the entire
Yes,
operations budget.
sorry, that is not completely clear. It is
Okay.
not, the amount would just cover basically staffing and general operations, but it is not their entire budget.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you. So that,
Yeah.
the way it's written,
Yeah,
I
I'll make a note of
misunderstood
that.
that. Thank you very
Yes,
much.
it is not their entire budget.
That's a big deal. And as far as the others, the capacity, again, I think it's a great program that the city does. I mean, it's very rare that a nonprofit's had access to public funds for capacity building. And I mean, it's a great thing that our community does. Every one of them benefit. And I thought the reports we got last January for what happened in 2017, that was fantastic, to come in and afterwards and have people tell us how they benefited from this. And I think that's felt like a valuable partnership for all of us. So I appreciate the way that's unfolding, and I'm glad, and I'm looking forward to what we're going to hear January and January after that. Thank you.
Deputy Council President Batiste.
Thank you. So as I'm looking through this, just a couple of thoughts. I would echo some of the questions and comments that Councilmember Winterstein had just made, and to get more information about that. I know that, over the years, as we've looked at human services grants and then capacity building, and now we're talking about a sort of this third area, is just really trying to understand from a 10,000-foot level what everyone is applying for, and trying to sort of bring that together. I mean, I guess I'm constantly trying to bring all of that together under one umbrella so I can better understand it. But and we had also talked about the $10 per capita, which my understanding would be that would only be speaking about the human services grants. And so lots of questions that have come up, but the other comment that I wanted to make is that over the years, this has gotten so much better. I've watched everything evolve on the human services side in terms of how they are analyzing all of the grants and the criteria they're using. And now this program is also building out, and we're getting so much more information, and questions are popping up as we do that. But I feel like all of these processes are getting stronger, and it's starting to kind of come together under that umbrella, which has always been important for me. I've always wanted to see it that way. And the last comment that I wanted to make is that having the review panel, I think, is really powerful. And one thing that I really love seeing is that we brought together different commissions to form that panel, which is something that we've talked about in the past, is just getting that connection between the commissions at the city, and that's one way that we're doing that. So I think that there's a lot of good work, and things are evolving, but as you've heard from some of the questions, we probably, I'm thinking more information would be great in that area.
Councilmember Ramos.
Thank you. Again, I said I love the process this year for sure. And I really like one like Encompass Northwest. There's a new one coming in that's really capacity building. That's adding a location better in town here. That's the classic one that really fits perfectly in this situation. So I like that. I'm going to go back to the Friends of Lake Sammamish one time, and I have a suggestion. Because I'm afraid if we put this under a contract, that it gets lost next year. And I'd like to keep it very visible. And I'd say to keep it under the grant form, so the next year, if they come back, they need to come back through this process and somehow doesn't get lost in some kind of, contract thing that we're not aware of, because it is something different to me that is going to operations. Compared to the Issaquah Ops Trails Club, that to me, that's a volunteer coordinator, that's coordinating things, that fits under our Parks Department to work with them to do all that. That fits that definition for me under a contract. But the Friends of Lake Sammamish just doesn't quite get there for me. So I'd like to have them, reconsider keeping it very visible in this grant process in their own way. So if they come back next year, we can continue talking about this, because I do think this is something I don't want to get lost also in ongoing funding somewhere that's just really not visible every year that we're looking at. Because the point of this was very different in where it's going, and now it's just funding staff. That's not the point that we originally started with, for sure.
Well, I want to build off that a little bit. I think holistically, the subject of human services grants and sort of community grants, I would like to ask Councilmember Ray what he thinks about the idea of maybe asking the administration to bring this back to services as sort of a larger topic and talk about how we want to work this in 2019. And I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but I would love to get your thoughts.
I think, because I was about to raise my hand, your timing is perfect. I have this thing called grant program integration. We have a lot of grant programs, all very kind of targeted in different ways. I'd like to see us find a way to manage them holistically and in an integrated fashion, so we get the biggest bang for our buck. And so I would love to see the administration come back to services and have a discussion about how we can go about making something like that happen. Thank you, Council President Martz.
All right, so we don't take any action this evening, but certainly some administration was looking for some feedback. Some feedback was offered. Other questions, comments? Councilmember Hunt?
I think, so we had some discussion about what the two nonprofits that are recommended to be moved to contract for service, what their proposal would actually have covered. And I think it might also be helpful in the bigger discussion about what's being, more information about what is being covered under these capacity grants. I think it might be helpful, because my understanding, which is, and based on this graph that's on the screen right now, is that these were for specifically for targeted staffing, and then for Friends of Lake Sammamish also for marketing and outreach. I mean, I think that depending on how exactly that fits into their operations, that could be also capacity. So I think to see how they fit into the recommendations, it would be good to have more information about those, and then to be able to compare them to the other recommendations. But overall, I think that my inclination, based on the information, is that they do provide services for the city, and so they could be considered under this contract for service. And it would just be helpful to have more information to sort of confirm that. And then I also really appreciate the idea of looking at the bigger picture about how all of the community grants fit together. So that will be, I think, a really good conversation. And I think also I'll be interested to see, because as I mentioned, I think the human services grants, there's a trend increasing in those asks, and there's a trend increasing in the community needs as our population grows. And then for this program, for whatever reason, the asks have decreased a little bit. And so I wonder if there's maybe a need also for more outreach, so that new nonprofits, which are the ones that we want to see come forward for the first time with these capacity grants, would know about the program. As was pointed out, capacity grants, we don't want to see the same groups coming forward over and again with the same projects. We kind of want to see new projects coming forwards, and so I would think that would be increasing in sort of a similar pattern. And so it would be good to look at them together and then see what the options would be for how to make the different programs work together in a complementary way.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Nope. With that, I'll open it. Is there anyone in the public that wishes to speak to this issue? Mr. Kapler?
David Kapler, 255 Southeast Andrews. It's too bad Stacy's not here. She was the pro bono attorney. Then we formed Friends of Lake Sammamish State Park, and could give you a little more information about their ongoing efforts and their importance to the city. In terms of the Trails Club, it's kind of, we don't charge for our hikes. We offer over 100 a year. We have good insurance to cover anybody that's hurt on a hike. We've never had a claim, but we still have that insurance. So we have a lot of costs, and a lot of people in the club just don't bother submitting any costs they have. I forgot to submit my $105 booth fee from last year, so this year I might remember. But it's just, that's how the organization works. In terms of volunteering, most of our work has been with King County and DNR, to be blunt. The city has been in the past harder to work with, and I think that's changing or changed, but we have this other pattern. We do trail work all the time for DNR and county, especially DNR, basically on the part you see from Issaquah on Tiger Mountain. We never charge. The great organizations, Mountain to Sound Greenway, or other trail groups and all have contracts for doing their trail work. They use a lot of volunteers to do it, but they have their contracts to pay for their staff. So our work is with DNR and others is always just we agree on it and do it, and there's no cost. We provide all the tools, the fuel for any power tools, our own insurance, and all of that. So you can't just say it's got to be a certain percentage of the budget or something like that. You got to figure out how the organization really works. But I think almost everything I heard tonight from council sounded good. And I think all of this needs to be figured out a little bit better, for sure. But hopefully the city will look at 2019, a volunteer coordinator like Sammamish and other cities have to help get more volunteer work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kapler. All right. With that, we will move on. Now we're going to talk about ID 0304 Senior Center Update with Jeff Watling, our Parks and Recreation Director. Sorry, I sort of sped through that.
Thank you, Council President Martz. Good evening, Council. Yeah, excited to be here tonight, providing you an opportunity to hear a little bit of a lot of the work that we've been doing as we look at long-term operations of the Senior Center this year, and then in a lot of ways set the table and better prepare for the more in-depth discussion we'll be having on August 20th in work session. This discussion will certainly help us to be best prepared for that on the 20th, and really as we're marching towards and moving towards this policy discussion and ultimately a policy decision on long-term operation of that facility. So earlier this year, at the January 16th meeting, we requested the ability to pursue and explore if there's any potential operating partners for the Senior Center. With that request, we also requested some additional resources that you granted. Through that work, we interviewed a number of interested candidates and consultants. We ended up hiring a consultant, Wendy Watanabe, to partner with us in this work. That work really began in earnest in late February. She's been a great partner and a great resource with her senior services experience. We spent a lot of time, both Brian and I and the Parks Department and Courtney at the Senior Center, but also David Fujimoto and some of our sustainability staff reviewing the Senior Center Advisory Group report, taking a look at vision and values of how we want to see operation of the Senior Center long-term. In a lot of ways, Wendy's feedback was very confirming. It was very confirming of the work that we were able to do with the advisory group last year in terms of setting the vision and values that came out of that very public conversation about long-term operation of the facility. If you remember from that report I provided to you all last year, that there were some real anchor guiding principles that were set. Those guiding principles really, again, in a lot of ways were confirmed by the consultant and will continue to be very foundational as we move this conversation forward. We also began through the work with Wendy and Brian and I began a multitude of exploratory conversations with potential operating partners. This is both local nonprofit agencies that have had an interest in the senior center, that have provided some degree of senior service support. We also had conversations with many regional agencies and prospective partners. I think it was really good, important work because it really helped us to get an understanding of the lay of the land, who's out there, who is in a position to look at expansion, what are some of the issues that are facing really senior service agencies. We also took the time and did a survey amongst our senior center patrons and got some terrific feedback there. As I said earlier, those exploratory conversations, I think, again, were helpful, were positive, and that it really helped us to understand the lay of the land. What it really told us, though, the reality is there's not a lot of capacity. There's not a ton of interest. There aren't agencies lining up at our city border ready to come in and operate the facility. With that information, it did help us to frame what our more formal outreach was going to be. And so we put together a LOI process, a letter of interest, with the help of Wendy, issued that. That LOI process really looked a lot like an RFQ, but really allows us to find the agencies that do have an interest in pursuing operation, and then allowing us to have further conversation to vet what that partnership may look like. Had a chance in June, on June 12th, to update the Services and Safety Committee meeting. At that time, the LOI process hasn't closed. We did close that a couple of weeks ago. We had one response from that LOI, and that was from Eastside Friends of Seniors. What we're doing now is we've reviewed that, is we've scheduled a series of meetings with them. Our first meeting is this Friday. The intent of those meetings over these next few weeks is to learn more about the operating model that they're looking at, learn more about their capacity as an agency, as well as budget, what they're seeing and needing as an operating budget. This will give us a much clearer picture to provide to you on August 20th and understand what that opportunity looks like. Concurrently, at the same time, we are also looking and have been looking at what a long-term city operating model would look like. We've been building not only an operational plan, but what a budget would look like around that model. We feel like on the 20th, and what we want to be prepared to do on the 20th, is provide a good comparison, given that we have the one LOI response, just to allow us to measure what possible third-party operation would look like versus what city operation would look like. All along, as we've been going through this process, our goal has been transparency, really, in this 18 months of interim operation that we've been under so far with the Senior Center. So we have been sharing news with the Senior Center patrons as we've been going along, both as staff. Courtney and Brian doing a great job of that. I've had a chance to go over and join the seniors for lunch and give updates from time to time, and Mayor Pauley has done so as well. Our plan, like I said, on the 20th would be to take a look at these two long-term operating scenarios in a little more detail, be able to provide and do some comparison work on what programs and service models would look like, what staffing plans would look like, what budgets would look like, more specifically what city funding, and in a lot of ways what that net operating level may look like. Would love in our discussion, when I'm done with the staff report, to get an idea if there's any other information that you would deem helpful as we start to dive a little deeper into some specific operating models on the 20th. We also anticipate, as we're moving into this decision process, some public engagement during this phase. We would love the opportunity to seek some feedback if there's residents who have preference on either of those operating models. Again, as we discuss this, we could do it either way. I'd really want to know your interest. Would you like to have that information prior to the 20th or following the 20th? The plan, schedule-wise, would be following that conversation on the 20th, moving towards some type of policy direction in September. That would allow us, as we're working with the mayor's office on the budget that'll be presented to you in October, we'd be able to take that, at least that direction, and build the 2019 budget accordingly, and then move right into budget deliberations this fall.
Questions? No, there are some. Councilmember Ray.
These are sort of questions and sort of comments, so since Mayor Pauly's not here to tell me I can't make comments. I just want to say, I think the Parks Department and the team at the Senior Center recovered from a very difficult situation, and from what I understand, the feedback from the patrons of the Senior Center is very, very high right now. So, you know, kudos to everybody who jumped into that breach to get that ship on an even keel. So a couple things that I think are really important that we consider when looking at the different options. One is, what are the cost comparisons? What's the absolute dollars out of pocket if we run it as a city service versus a not-for-profit? The other one is, what are the other funding options that are available in terms of grants for the city versus grants for not-for-profits? And then finally, and you touched on this, Jeff, a little bit, is how do we solicit the people who actually use the Senior Center, how do we solicit their input, and how do we ask them what they considered their desired outcomes? What do they want this to look like? And so instead of getting, a third party or the city, let's talk about the outcomes we're trying to achieve, and then, what are the factors, the things that would be critical to success in achieving those outcomes. And I, more than anything else, want to hear from those folks about what success would look like to them. There wasn't a question in there at all.
Good feedback. I'm asking for feedback.
That works for these also. Other questions or feedback? Councilmember Ramos. And then Councilmember.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, and really doing a great job. I love the Senior Center now, and I stop by occasionally because I actually qualify, but we'll whisper that. Anyway, but the other thing I guess I'd like to keep in mind, those things like where nonprofits could fit to more advantageous than city, there's consideration. I also like to consider what the city's doing now of considering public rental of that facility when it's not being used as a senior center, particularly on weekends and so forth, because that is a wonderful facility. Issaquah is in dire need of meeting spaces and where folks can get together. So when you're playing with those models, really try to consider that, keeping that option as open as possible, because I think it's a great service for the community when the senior center is not using it, because it's a great place, and I think our city is in dire need of places like that to be able to use and to rent out for various folks. So keep that in mind as well.
Councilmember Hunt.
Thank you. Thank you for the list of information that will be provided at August 20th. I think it's a pretty comprehensive list. One thing that I would be, I would additionally like to see would be if there's a staffing model also, so how much, how is that going to impact operations? So sort of a bigger picture on how does this impact Parks operations if Parks operations is staffing, and what does that look like in Parks operations if another entity is managing the senior center. So I think that would be the one sort of big question that I have that isn't on the list.
When you say park operations, more park department, impact to department?
Right, in terms of, does this allow sort of organization of, or different organizations, different people to take different roles, or any sort of adjustments like that? Because I imagine that it is it's managing this, whether you do that or not, doesn't, it affects how the rest of the department operates, I would think.
That's a whole new service unit that we'd be entering into, yep.
Deputy Council President Batiste.
So Jeff, thanks for the presentation and the overview. This has been a long road, and I just wanted to thank the staff and everyone who has been working toward this point, because it's been a lot of hard work, and we just get so many great comments back about how everyone is feeling about the senior center now. So that's fantastic. And I think when we go forward to the 20th, just overviews of the public communication and outreach is important. And then just sort of best practices, lessons learned, how things would be structured going forward, so we would not, face any of the problems we've had in the past. So an overview of that, I think, would be important.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions or comments? So I'll add that, when we look at things in August, I really want, one of the areas for me will be the counterpoint to the cost of the various options is going to be what, if any, difference we see in potential service delivery. And that was something that when we were looking at the operation of the senior center previously was a really important part of the ultimate decisions that we made to bring this in under temporary city oversight. And so it'll be a big part of whatever the next stage is for us. And what things, under the various options, what things we think we would be able to do internally, what things we think we would be able to partner with, and so how that would impact the users of the senior center. That's a real area of interest of mine.
So not just cost, but sort of benefit.
Yep. What kind of programs that we expect to be able to offer. Councilmember Ray.
So as I was listening to my esteemed colleague at the end of the dais, have we looked at a hybrid model? So including both city staff and not-for-profit working in a collaborative way too? So, a little bit of a best of breed?
We've explored operating models, yes, even to the point of last year. I think this LOI process, and again, I don't mean, these conversations we'll be having with this prospective partner, it'll be great to explore what their interests are, what their capacity is. Right now, we're looking at one or the other, but there's nothing to preclude if what comes out of this is some type of partnered operation.
Yeah, and as you were responding, I was being inspired. There's going to be some transition period if we say do transition to a not-for-profit. So how would we operate in that transition period, and kind of working through that as we look at the different options about, do we do a full transition? How long do we take to transition? Work through those kind of questions. I think would be really interesting to explore on the 20th.
Be a careful part of either model is, transition.
Other questions? Councilmember Winterstein.
Thank you. Jeff, this is only related to the facility, like Bill talked about weekends and maybe evenings. Perhaps a year ago, some former staff of yours and some former people from, I think it was Catholic Community Services, who were had conversations about the meals program potentially using that facility. I think this was something Katie had conversations with them about, and I know that conversation just never went anywhere, and I don't know if it was ever brought to your attention, but if that is something that could be maybe brought to a logical conclusion, I think it was never really concluded. I think it just fell off the plate. I do know that program over there, many people who've put it on did, after understanding and seeing what was at this other building, felt that was a far superior location. So put that in your calculus, please, and if it's not to be, it's not to be. But now, since the time you're looking at overall operations of that building as well, that would be one that I would ask you to look at.
Yep. Thank you. Yep. Absolutely. I was aware of that exploratory work. We did respond and let CCS know. We felt in the interim that we are right now it'd be hard to commit to anything long-term as we look at what the long-term operating model, looking at that programmatic piece and what it would mean to be there, what it would mean. I think it'll be interesting to compare, and just for preparation for the 20th, even as we look at city operating model, that revenue piece is an important one. And Councilmember Ramos touched on those evenings. Do we make evenings available for rental and capturing some rental to help offset that net operating cost? Or do we look at doing something programmatically that might not be a revenue piece? There's a cost benefit to that we'd want to certainly consider. But it is in the mix as
Thank you.
something to discuss.
Anything else? Nope. All right, well, thank you very much. Anything else from you, Jeff? Nope. All right, any regional activities or issues that anybody wants to bring up? Nope. I'll bring up one real. Oh, I'm sorry. We will take comments. You have some thoughts on this, Mr. Kaplan?
Yeah, I don't want to have to sue the city or a new group like I had to do the last one, but when they were trying to give away all the assets. And we had at least saved one bus and some other assets. But anyway, people who at the senior center, when things were going really bad and when the first cities started taking over, they went out to a lot of different places to look and check them out. And some had already were pretty familiar with other senior centers. And the one that they talked about, I think the most, maybe was maybe a tie with Redmond, was Kent, which this young man here knows something about. And that was often talked about and still talked about how great the Kent Senior Center is. So, but I'm sure it's not cheap, and I'm sure the city running this is not going to be cheap. If it's some kind of hybrid, even if it's almost 100% a different group running it, there's still going to be oversight, I'm convinced, and not be like we had before, where I felt the city had oversight, but they chose not to exercise it till way at the end. But I think whichever way it goes, the people right now are really happy. When you go over there and talk to them, it's going to be hard for any group to be better than what the city's been doing, I would say. But at the same time, it could be the city pays well, right? Cities people are not are expensive, and they're high quality people. But how you balance the needs of our senior citizens with the cost is that's your job. So I think we'll end up with something really great, or continue something really great.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kaplan. So, Councilmember Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Kapler. That made me think of one thing that I think would help me with this conversation, which would just be case studies or a couple examples of operating models from other cities. That would be helpful, because then I could see how other success stories have worked out. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Anything else? And now, Councilmember
I want
Winterstein.
to mention one thing, Tola. You do not have a Land and Shore Committee meeting next month. I hope you saw that announcement.
I did see that.
So you won't miss that one. All right.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Heads up. I'll mention for the good of order one thing, which is a little bit serious. There was news this weekend that Burien Mayor Jimmy Mata got attacked at the Old Burien Block Party, and a lot of the details are still up in the air, but it looks pretty troubling, and all of us who are involved in municipal government certainly have our thoughts out for Mayor Mata. They did actually arrest a suspect this evening in that attack. So I just thought I would mention that and just mention our thoughts are with Mayor Mata. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.